We all know that poor sleep can impact us. It impacts us in almost every facet of our well-being and performance, to be honest. This podcast, I had the opportunity of chatting with Nick Lambe, who is the online sleep coach. Nick is a strength coach and massage therapist, but he's also a sleep coach. He is a ball of knowledge, and we talked about a lot of different topics within this 1 hour. We talk about things like circadian rhythm, biological clock, the difference between sleep quality versus sleep quantity, which is interesting because I've been wearing the Oura Ring and the Whoop Band, both of which track those things, and I learned a lot from Nick. He also goes into the three main causes of sleep issues and sleep problems. And then most importantly, we get into behavioral changes that you can make today to optimize your sleep health. Hope you guys enjoy this one.
The Prehab audio experience will teach you how to take control of your health through knowledge by optimizing performance, promoting longevity, and keeping your movement system in tune. Welcome to your host, the Prehab guys.
How's it going, everyone? Today we have Nick Lambe, the online sleep coach. This is awesome because I've been tracking my sleep a lot more recently, and there's a lot of questions I have. But thanks for hopping on, Nick. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I guess first, how did you even get into this niche of sleep and learning more about sleep and trying to educate people on how to improve their sleep quality?
For sure. So I am originally a strength coach and personal trainer, and have been for about the last decade. The majority of that time was spent working in PT clinics and spent working with injury-based populations. So, whether it's someone recovering from injury or kind of working back the roads to doing what they were doing previously. And I really was always fascinated more with the health side of things. So things that went into the health spectrum that predisposed someone to injury versus someone else. And then when someone was actually injured, what were the variables and things that impacted their length of recovery and, them really getting back to what they love. So that really led me to just dive into a lot of different variables, the behavior side of things, stress management, nutrition, obviously. And sleep obviously was a big component of that. And I really just became fascinated with everything about sleep. And I think even more so, I was fascinated by how little attention that sleep got relative to exercise and nutrition, especially in the context of, how we actually approach it in the clinical world, right? How do we optimize it? How do we coach it? And just the more that I dug, the more that I realized that just wasn't really being done. So.
Yeah. And how long have you been in this niche of sleep, I guess, educating people about sleep and how to improve sleep? How long has that been?
So it's been at least 4 or 5 years that it's been like a serious part of the conversation that I'm having with clients.
Yeah.
And then about two and a half years ago, I started to offer it where I was working at the time, a PT and wellness clinic. I started to offer it as adjunct service, where it was a separate thing where people were coming exclusively for sleep coaching. And I would interject that a few different ways. Sometimes it would just be at the onset of working with a new training client. Sometimes it would be a 6-week block where I was really working with someone just on their sleep. And I kind of took that more online. About 6 months later, just started doing, sleep consultations online. Sometimes it was just educational for people that wanted to learn more. And sometimes it was obviously people who were actually struggling with their sleep. And then I guess about 6 months ago, I kind of veered more into the space of educating other coaches and other practitioners, just because, like we talked about, I just felt it wasn't getting enough attention. It wasn't getting talked about enough. It wasn't getting addressed enough.
I completely agree. So how does that conversation initially start? Because I know if I ask a patient sometimes, hey, how's your sleep? They're like, it's good. That's not a problem with anything, even though we see time after time that sleep has such an impact. Even with something as simple as injury risk, we see that it increases when sleep goes down. But oftentimes they're like, it's fine. That's not a problem. I guess, how does that conversation get sparked for you? And how have you learned to dig deeper and try to truly understand and get a realization of how to improve this person's sleep?
So the first step comes down to the practitioner, and you have to prioritize it and in your process, right? So I think that's the first step, is a changing of the narrative for yourself, right? Because if you don't prioritize it, and I was in this bucket for sure of, you're in that scenario and the client says, oh yeah, my sleep is fine. If you're just kind of checking the box of, all right, this is on my intake form, and they answered, no, they don't have sleep issues, or, whatever the case is, and you just kind of skim over it and you keep going, that's on us as the coach or as the practitioner. So the first step is really prioritizing it in your clinical process, right? Really valuing the fact that it can impact, regardless of whether you're working in the performance sector, the fitness sector, rehabilitation, understanding and appreciating that it's going to play a role in some way, shape, or form. And even if the client, this is another thing, even if the client isn't necessarily dealing with a chronic sleep issue, they don't have chronic insomnia. I think, if you walk into any Starbucks on any given day, right, at any time, we're masking something. People are over caffeinating, they're overcompensating in some way, shape, or form. So I think even those people who are thinking that they're getting by, right, there's always a way to be more optimal. I think people have forgotten what it's like to really function at optimal.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different strategies, buy-in strategies and things that we can talk about, or we can kind of talk specifically what the assessment process looks like after that. But just circling back, it really comes down to that prioritization for the practitioner and the coach.
Yeah, no, that's interesting that you brought that up, because I did see a study, this was a couple of years ago, where if someone got a little bit less sleep, like we're saying 6 to 7.5 hours, I think they saw that the individual didn't think that they were cognitively impaired, but they were. But if they went even less than that, then it was like 4 to 6 hours at that point. Then the individual knew they were cognitively impaired, and they were. So there's a point that people are performing at a less higher level and aren't even aware of it, because they're, then
the self-estimation is, especially at the surface level, self-estimation, people are really poor at self-estimating their own sleep quality, and their performance and their subsequent performance. And especially because it's typically a long-term thing, right? And it just becomes this new norm, this new baseline that's set for them. And to them, that's just normal, right? To wake up and immediately need a cup of coffee or whatever the case is. So it's just their new baseline, and they've kind of forgotten what it feels like to, be fully rested.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go into, I guess, I think the meat and potatoes would be like the sleep itself. Like, I know 6 hours, 8 hours of sleep are not created equal. And I want to see from your research and what you talk to your clients and other coaches about is what obviously optimal is not the same for everybody. How much you stress yourself may impact how much sleep you need that night. How little you stress yourself, obviously you'll need less sleep to recover from. But what have you found is like a sweet spot for optimal sleeping in terms of quantity itself? I know quality may be a whole different discussion, but let's start there.
Yeah, sure. So you kind of hit the nail on the head. It's very difficult to, you're having this conversation. I never usually recommend a specific duration for people. I mean, taking a step back, if we look at what makes up healthy sleep, if I were to, define what healthy sleep is, you can look at it in 4 pillars. And, the quantity and duration would be one of those pillars. The depth, right? So the electrical signature of that sleep in terms of brain waves and what's actually occurring. The quality would be the next. Continuity would be the other, and then regularity. So obviously we can talk a lot about circadian rhythms and consistency and how much your body craves consistency, but the regularity. So
what's the difference between the third and the fourth? Sorry to cut you off. Continuity.
Continuity is continuity throughout the night, right? So a lot of times, based on different lifestyle variables and based on different sleep disorders that people can have, you get fragmented sleep. So take alcohol, for example, can fragment your sleep, where you're getting these mini awakenings that are disrupting your sleep cycle, sometimes without you even realizing. So it's the continuity of you being able to go through these stages of sleep and through these cycles of sleep throughout the night without any interruptions.
I got you.
And the regularity is more the timing and the consistency, with respect to that circadian rhythm.
Yeah, like sleeping at the same time every night, or more importantly, waking up at the same time every morning, right? Seems to be more important than even sleeping at the same time.
Exactly. And then, we could talk more about it, but you take those circadian preferences a step further. And the more you dive into that and the more you dive into circadian biology, the more you realize that, ideally, a lot of different physiological processes will fall in the circadian rhythm. And the more that we understand that, and the more we understand what is the optimal time to do certain things, the optimal time to eat, exercise, do your most productive work, all of those things based on what your genetic makeup is and what your genetic preference is. The more of those things that you get in line, it's not only beneficial for your health, but it's beneficial for your sleep, your performance, all those things kind of fall
I got
in
you.
line.
So you're going into chronotypes then, because people have different chronotypes, and based on your chronotype, you're designed genetically to be more of maybe a morning person, or I guess the easiest examples would be morning person and then the night owl. But there's things in
it's
between.
easiest to look at the extremes on each end for sure.
Okay.
But yeah, exactly. It's the understanding that these chronotypes exist, that there's a genetic component to it. So, lifestyle and environment will certainly play a role to manipulate it to a certain extent, but it is ingrained, from a genetic perspective to a certain extent. So it's the appreciation of that. And then like I said, trying to get as many variables in line with what your preference is as possible.
Do you have your athletes and clients take these chronotype quizzes, or is it more of a subjective that you take people through to figure that out?
It's both. So there's a few different resources, a few things that are available. The Power of When quiz is usually the easiest to go to. It comes from the book The Power of When by Dr. Michael Bryce, who he really kind of introduces the concept of chronotypes and talks about them and categorizing them in a little bit of a different way. Then there were some questionnaires as well. There's the Munich questionnaire. There's the morning eveningness questionnaire. So, I think intuitively, for the people that are on the extremes, they typically know. But it's, where you fall somewhere in the middle, and there can certainly be some overlap. So, the questionnaires and the quizzes are definitely, helpful to kind of to pinpoint. But
yeah, thinking about it now, when I took my 23andMe test, it did mention what was the ideal time, I think, for me to wake up, which I don't know how they got that or if that's accurate or not. But
yeah, I'm not sure if so the gene that actually determines this chronotype is a set of genes is the PER genes. They just recently discovered these genes and their prevalence in 2017. It was a Nobel Peace Prize for 2017.
Oh, wow.
I'm not sure if like the 23andMe are collecting that data, and if they're not, I'm not really sure how they would actually get that, but I'd be curious to know for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, let's say you find someone's chronotype and they are a night owl. However, they still have to wake up, and their job requires them to perform at 7 a.m., 6 a.m. Mentally. At that point, I mean, how would that discussion go? Because not everyone has the luxury of being able to sleep when they want, wake up when they want. I mean, I think I heard somewhere that humans are the only animals that actually set an alarm clock in the morning. Because we just live in such a busy lifestyle, unlike these other animals that are out there.
Yeah, and self-deprive themselves of sleep.
And sleep
intentionally deprive themselves of sleep in a lot of instances. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a tricky scenario, and it's a lot of different variables, and there's the circadian piece of it is only one pillar to optimization. So there's a lot of other things, the behavioral side of things, and we could talk a lot about the behaviors and ingraining the right routines and having the right thought process around your sleep that leads into that.
Yeah.
But it comes back to, even if you can't get your sleep timing in line with what that preference would be, you can still align a lot of those other variables, and it'll help still keep a healthy circadian rhythm.
Gotcha.
But and then it just comes down to routine and prioritization to understand your timing, understand your body a little bit sometimes. And this is where the quality versus quantity comes down sometimes, where people get so fixated on the quantity, and that's really the thing that we talk about, and the only thing we talk about with healthy sleep. So, sometimes it's people are better served going to bed actually like a half hour or an hour later, that would be better in line with their rhythm, and where they're not, stressed out, or they're not, whatever the case is, they're able to go through their routine and get really, really good quality of sleep. And that also builds traction into future nights, as opposed to just forcing yourself to go to bed at, 9 or 10 o'clock, because that would be 7 or 8 hours and you have to, right? I always use the analogy of like, and this is a behavioral strategy, but I always use the analogy of food, right? You wouldn't go and just sit at the dining room table and wait to be hungry.
Yeah.
Right? You'd only go and sit and eat when you're actually hungry, right? So the same applies for sleep. And the brain is very associative. So, once you start making your bed and your bedroom a place for wakefulness, you start to get into, muddy waters, and it really starts to associate. The brain very quickly makes that association.
That's a really good analogy. I think Matt Walker has said something similar too, where it's like, if you're laying down and you're not sleeping within a little bit, don't just try forcing it. It's that same idea
don't try harder. Yeah.
Don't try harder. Exactly.
You can't try harder with sleep, and the harder you try, the more you're going in the opposite direction.
But then you're stressing yourself out. And then next thing you know, you're not going to be going to sleep.
Exactly.
That's interesting. So I think let's go into behavior. I think that'd be something cool that people can definitely take home from this. And I'm curious to learn more about myself. So
Sure.
I guess what are some low hanging fruits in terms of behavior that people can change, or maybe even some things that people think they're doing right but aren't doing right?
Yeah. So, taking a step back, and this is honestly where, in my opinion, I think we're missing the boat with respect
Yeah.
to sleep. You see a lot of sleep hygiene lists that focus on a lot of the lifestyle variables and, all those things, and that's great. And it brings more awareness. And if people do those things, they're certainly going to, move the needle in the right direction. But, I categorize the causes of sleep issues in three ways. So we have three buckets here. I call them the three P's. So the first is predisposing factors. So these are things that set someone up to, exactly as the name suggests, be predisposed to dealing with sleep issues. So someone who has higher levels of anxiety, lower distress tolerance, any of those things that are going to set you up to be more likely to have to deal with a sleep issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Second set of factors is the precipitating factors. And this is probably the most common and the one that is universally something that we all deal with. And these are anything that sets forth a period of, not great sleep, whether it's, increased period of stress, a loss, a new job, you're sick, whatever it is, right? And then for a certain period of time, you're not sleeping well. But what often happens is that leads into the third set of factors, which are the perpetuating factors. So the perpetuating factors are the negative or potentially negative thoughts, behaviors, habits, emotions, right? That manifest that will allow a sleep issue to become more chronic, and typically what perpetuates that sleep issue to stick around long term. So regardless of what may have precipitated it, regardless of some of those other factors, right? Even you take someone with a sleep disorder, right, and they get whatever the physiology that was associated with that sleep disorder dealt with, it's the resulting behaviors that are left over. And just in general, the fact that these, negative thoughts and behaviors exist are going to really drive a lot of the issues that people can potentially have with sleep. You could take it just like anything else, whether it's exercise, whether it's rehab, right? If someone doesn't have the right mindset and someone doesn't have the right perceptions and the right thought process going into things, you're really going to have a lot harder of a time, having success long term. So there's a lot of things that will fit into this sleep bucket, but the behavior bucket, the first is just the prioritization. So, what I do in my coaching process is I spend a lot of time obviously talking about clients' goals and taking a deep dive into those goals, just like any other facet of coaching, right? But even more importantly is, why are those goals important to them, right? Really connecting to that intrinsic motivation behind their goals, and then finding a way to connect sleep to that goal. The nice part about that is, because sleep impacts just about every facet of our well-being and our performance, you're going to find a way where you can connect sleep to that goal. So, that's one piece of it, is really the prioritization, the figuring out the why. You have to get people really bought in from the perspective of sleep.
Yeah.
The next thing, is the stimulus control, like we just talked about. So stimulus control is basically just the idea of trying to keep your bed and bedroom as powerful of a trigger for sleep as possible, and not a trigger for wakefulness. So the more things that you do in your bed and bedroom that aren't sleep, again, the more that the brain makes that association. So, I even down to the level of, I try to discourage people from, reading in their bedroom or doing other work in their bedroom, bringing the laptop into the bedroom, anything that's not sleep, just because you want to, as much as possible, make that bed and bedroom really just this cue for sleep, that as soon as you're there, it's the place for sleep.
That makes perfect sense. Any other behavioral recommendations? What about, I guess, something I'd be curious about is eating. Because I use the Aura and Whoop, and I try to find correlation, because I'm sure everyone is different and there's no perfect answer for these things.
Sure.
But I've noticed that when I eat a large meal right before sleeping, maybe within an hour, it definitely dampers the amount of time I end up in deep or REM sleep. I feel like if I have that meal a couple hours beforehand, and I've read this online as well, where you want to have it at least 3 hours beforehand, it can improve your sleep quality.
Yeah, 100%. So, for me, the nutrition piece kind of fits into a different bucket of lifestyle. So in my pillars of optimization, kind of working the way up, it's lifestyle, but it's 100% that what you mentioned. So the reason for that is twofold. Firstly, your body has a more difficult time going into a state of sleep when it's prioritizing digestion. The other is that when you eat too close to bed, you actually elevate your body's core temperature. So one of the really powerful cues when we talk about that circadian rhythm is a drop in your body's core temperature. So anything that works in the opposite direction of that is really gonna work against you. So, same thing kind of applies to exercise. We know that exercise can really benefit sleep for a multitude of ways that we can talk about, but it's the same thing where the timing really matters. And if it's set up too close to bedtime, you're going to have exactly that. You're going to get spikes in cortisol, right? You're going to get elevation in the core body temperature, and you're just going to be working in the opposite thermal direction of what you want.
What would you say for exercise then? Roughly how many hours prior to sleep would be a safe spot to work out?
If you really want to cover basis and be safe, just because, just like anything, it's different person to person.
Sure.
I would say about 4 hours.
4 hours and the workout, or you can
at the end of the workout. Okay. Yeah. So giving yourself 4 hours from the time you complete your workout to, when your bedtime is, I think would be pretty safe for most. Some people can definitely get away with 3 or maybe even a little less, but again, just, not really being able to quantify how quickly, how much your cortisol levels are coming back down and all of these things. It's better to give yourself a bigger window when possible.
Sure. And then, obviously it depends how intense the workout is, how long you worked out, how sleep deprived you are generally. Okay. What about sleep aid in itself? I've seen some things. I don't know how well this is researched, but obviously melatonin is that drug or supplement that a lot of people lean on. But then there's the benzos as well, which is the step above that are a little more aggressive. But I guess in terms of sleep aid, like let's say you have a client or a coach that's working with you that some of their athletes just have some difficulty, even though they're implementing all of these lifestyle and changes that we're recommending. How does that conversation go with using a sleep aid?
Yeah. So I think with respect, if we're talking about coaches and practitioners, and if you're going through all these processes of the behavioral approach and, the circadian rhythms and stress management and lifestyle and all of these things, and you're not seeing results, a big part of the coaching process is making sure at the onset, just like anything, you're doing a thorough medical history. So a big part of the process is screening for sleep-related disorders and just medical conditions in general that could potentially disrupt sleep. You have to really have an understanding of, what conditions can have, comorbidities with sleep issues. And what you see is a lot of them have a bi-directional relationship, but you want to know about these things at the onset. There are certainly instances where, people get stuck and it's very difficult for them to get out of it. So I've worked alongside therapists before in my sleep coaching process where, someone is currently taking sleeping pills. And we can certainly talk more about sleeping pills and some of the implications, but it's a conversation with that therapist, with that physician, and hopefully they're open-minded to your coaching process, but you're working to ultimately wean the person off of the use of those sleeping pills. But it's not something that obviously as a coach you should be taking on by yourself in any way, shape, or form. There's a right and a wrong way to tamper off of these things. And but with respect to sleeping pills, you kind of touched on benzos being probably the most common when we talk about sleeping pills. The first thing to understand with these is that they don't induce naturalistic sleep. So when you look at, if you were to be in a sleep lab and we were to look at your brain waves and, that's how we would measure what stages of sleep you're in, what's actually occurring, it would look different when you're on a benzo, when you're on a sedative, as opposed to naturalistic sleep. So I think that's
do you know how that is, like what the difference would be?
It's just in the brain waves that you're getting. So your deeper stages of sleep, especially, it's just it's, if you were to compare the brain waves, right, they wouldn't be the same.
Wouldn't be the same. Okay.
So I think, there's a difference. I I liken it to, obviously you're still eventually going to get into stages of sleep and you can still get restorative sleep to a certain extent, but I liken it to, there's a difference between sedation and sleep in the brain. I think people mistake this a lot. So this is especially true when we talk about, and this is kind of going on a tangent, but especially true when we talk about alcohol, right? People will say a lot that they use alcohol as a nightcap, right? Like I drink a glass of wine and dude, I'm out. Like I pass out, right? It's like, exactly, you passed out. You sedated the brain. You didn't induce, what we would characterize as that natural drift of sleep. So I think that's the distinction. The more scary part of the sleeping pills is, I think we're learning more and more about the negative associations with respect to overall health. So we're starting to see sleeping pill use being linked with correlation and prevalence of a lot of different diseases. Certain
like neurodegenerative issues,
neurodegenerative issues, certain types of cancer, cancer of the breast, cancer of the prostate, cancer of the bowel.
Oh, wow.
Overall mortality, we're seeing a pretty strong correlation as well. And the proposed reason for this is, most of these aids, especially in the context of sleep, when they were tested, they were looking at them in the short term. What you really see is people using them for months and years when they may have only been tested and approved for periods of weeks.
Gotcha. Is this for just benzos or even things like melatonin over the counter?
So less for over the counter. With over the counter, I think it's the same conversation of sedation versus sleep and good sleep quality, right? That same depth and quality of sleep, but not to the same extent as when we're talking about the benzos. The negative health implications are more with the benzos. Although I could argue, with certain over the counters, melatonin, we're talking a little bit safer, but with certain over the counters like Tylenol PM or any of these things, you start to talk about the potential disruption that it has in your overall sleep health and your overall sleep quality. And I could probably argue that long term, it could lead to negative health outcomes, because of the fact that it's setting you up for poor sleep long term.
Yeah.
And I think the idea too is, if you are using these, the idea is to only be using them in the very, very beginning of the process, in conjunction with a physician, doing it the right way, trying to, just get you out of this rut that you might be in, get you out of this cycle, and then, maybe transitioning into some of the behavioral coaching that helps you set up and succeed long term. So,
gotcha. Temporary aid. That's all it should be.
Exactly. The American College of Physicians, with about a year or two ago, listed cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia as the first line of treatment, or proposed prescribed treatment for insomnia, in place of sleeping pills. So, it's the shifting away from, the use of sleeping pills and trying to go through the more behavioral route. So I think things are trending that way, but there's just not a lot of those practitioners available. There's not a lot of CBTI providers, but I think if more coaches are embracing these behavioral components of sleep and all those things, I think it'll go a long way.
There's definitely a lot more sleeping pills than sleep coaches that are out there. That's for sure.
For sure. It's a hell of a lot easier to just take a script of a sleeping pill than going to see a sleep coach. And it's just like any of the other elements of what we do with respect to health and fitness.
Same thing. You said your wife's a PT. Like, you see people, they have shoulder pain. Oh, take this opioid. Try this out for a little bit. Oh, pain's gone. Okay, that's what you needed. Then you stop, pain's back, or worst case, you get addicted to those.
Exactly.
But really, the key here is to address the issue and not rely on these aids. And it seems like you talked about all these things that it can potentially lead to side effect wise. I heard that it minimizes the removal of tau proteins. So you can even potentially get maybe there's correlation there between getting Alzheimer's long term with using these.
Sure, yeah. So again, because it's not inducing that natural, so the deeper stages of non-REM sleep, those stages 3 and 4, it's actually been discovered that your what we call glymphatic system is very active during this state, where you get bathing of cerebral spinal fluid throughout the brain. The cells actually shrink within the brain, and you have this opportunity for this cerebral spinal fluid to actually come in and clear out toxins. But that only occurs in those deeper restorative stages of sleep. So anything that's disrupting that process, is going to potentially have those correlations with neurodegenerative disease. So I think that's why, we're seeing these strong correlations, not just with the sleeping pill use, but with, poor sleep quality and, the prevalence of these diseases as well.
And then sedation creates less time in those type deep third and fourth stage of sleeping.
Correct. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then the other thing is, and you already kind of touched on it, is, when people are using these sleeping pills, it's not addressing the root cause. So, people will often get, what we call rebound insomnia. So they'll come off of the sleeping pills and, it's even worse than it was before because they don't address the root cause. And obviously there's an element, just like any prescribed drug, there's an element of dependency and all of that plays into things as well. So it's just, long term, it's just a dangerous and slippery slope. It's not to look down on, physicians who prescribe it or look down on people who are taking it. I get it. Being in a situation where you're not sleeping, you kind of get in a desperate situation. But I think this is just where I hope to trend things, is more people coaching sleep and just helping people out with respect to that.
No, that's a really good point. And talking about addressing the cause, it seems like those 3 P's were the cause oftentimes of why people are not sleeping well. Which one of those 3 do you feel like has been the most prevalent or the most common in the clients you've worked with?
And it's the perpetuating factor. So it's the behaviors. So I think, when I talk about like the behaviors being so important, I have basically 4 pillars to sleep optimization, and they're in a hierarchy. So they're in, levels that I'll address, where the behavioral piece is the first, just because of how strong that I found that in my coaching process. So, it's based on experience, and what I found with people is, even if, we place a lot of emphasis on the technology and the lifestyle, and don't get me wrong, those things certainly play a role, but especially with people dealing with chronic issues and, those issues really sticking around long-term, it's the negative associations that people have. So, for example, anyone who's ever went a period of struggling with sleep, they lose their confidence in their ability to generate sleep, and they start to get these really, strong misconceptions and wrong perceptions around sleep, and they really dramatize their inability to sleep, and it just fuels this vicious cycle that, a good part of the coaching process is trying to break that cycle, right? Restructuring their thoughts, breaking down some of those misconceptions, and but I think, honestly, that has been the biggest thing, is just, that behavioral piece, the things that go into the behavioral side of things, and then the circadian rhythms, and once you align those preferences with your circadian rhythm, that makes a huge difference. The other pillar is stress management. So dampening down of the arousal system, especially around the timing of sleep. We definitely see, this being a really common thread, where people will get, as we know, people have a very overactive sympathetic nervous system. So we see, mistimed spikes in their autonomic nervous system, where, cortisol will jack up around bedtime, sometimes even in the middle of the night, and a lot of times this comes back to the behavioral aspect, right? So it's all back to the behavior, where the behavior will drive some of those spikes in cortisol. We know we can drive our physiology with our thoughts. So someone who really has a negative, thought process around their sleep, and is really dreading their sleep because they know they're not going to get a good night's sleep, right? That's when you start to see some of those potentially cortisol spikes and all those things that are going to work against you. So again, just the idea of that cycle that we're trying to break.
With that stress management piece, would you have people maybe meditate or do some type of relaxation before they even go to sleep, and maybe have a mantra like "I can sleep well," and have them try to believe this thought that sleep is going to be okay for them, and they don't have to be this identity, this person that only gets 4 or 5 hours of sleep every night just because they have poor sleep hygiene?
Yeah, definitely. So, the first step is always the thought restructuring. So what are the, sometimes crazy thoughts and perceptions that people have? Get those on the table right away, and like having people be honest with those, excuse me, with those thoughts and what those are. So, this will come down to them writing it down. I have them verbalize it. So we take their negative thoughts and we restructure them in a positive way. And then I have them basically practice that, right? So they write them down, they say them out loud. Hopefully they can engage in a conversation with someone else about it. So it's just, this becomes routine. And, sometimes if you say it enough and you write it enough, it kind of becomes
subconscious. Yeah,
exactly. It becomes your new reality. So that's really a meditative tool that we'll use. One of the more powerful ones and very simple that we do is kind of along the lines of that is just a brain dump, right? So take whatever time you're going to bed, maybe subtract, half hour, 45 minutes, an hour, and just write down everything that's on your mind, right? So
Yeah.
whatever you're thinking, whatever your to-dos are, whatever your worries are, just get them on paper. And there's something about, even if they still exist, obviously, something about having them on paper, is really huge, because I think the majority of people do most of their thinking when their head hits the pillow, right?
Yeah.
That's the only free, quiet moment that they have all day.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to carve out another, even if it's only 5 minutes.
That's exactly what I used to do, actually. Just 5 minutes, brain dump, turn off all my devices, whatever's on my mind, throw it on paper. That way also I'm a little more in tune with my thoughts. And then from that point, I just lay down and I'm a lot more relaxed. And then, I wanted to ask you too about, what about listening to a podcast or having the TV on before sleep? I know a lot of times people get into their own heads. This may be coming back to that stress management piece, because they're just thinking about things nonstop. And they almost need this external piece of something to focus on, whether it's a podcast or music or TV. But I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that and sleeping and how that could affect
it's
sleep.
definitely dependent, but I think, for example, when we talk about people trying to improve their sleep, and the technology is certainly important, like, you can't be on screen time, and, you shouldn't be in front of the screen. But, I think it gets overblown a little bit. And I think some of the other things that we're talking about here tend to be more important. So dampening down that arousal system, the right behavior and thought process. So I think anything that, especially just if you're only doing it for a little bit, anything that breaks you out of that cycle and helps you to be more relaxed, and, worry less leading into sleep, I think is, that outweighs any potential risk of, you spending 20 minutes on a screen. I would say, if it's watching TV, going back to what we talked about earlier, I wouldn't do it in bed, because then it becomes this ritual where you're lying in bed and your brain and your body knows, oh, well, we're in bed, so it's time to watch TV. So you want it to be where as soon as you go into your bedroom and hit the bed, that's it. We're done. This is the only thing we're going to do, right? It's just sleep and sex in the bedroom, and that's it.
That's it.
So I think if you're going to be using TV, I would just, caution using it in the bedroom. But I think podcasts or any of those things are perfectly acceptable, especially if you find that it calms you down.
Yeah, I know that I use an eye mask, but I know there's an eye mask that actually has some type of earphones within it, so you can like toss and turn on the eye mask, and people have talked positively about it. I've never tried something like that, but I was curious about the podcast thing, because I don't know if that interfered with getting into deep sleep or not. But
and this is kind of an evolving field within sleep as well, is music therapy for sleep as well, which I find really interesting. I actually just listened to a podcast the other day with an expert in, I believe he's based out of Australia, and I actually just reached out to him, hoping that he'll come onto the course and talk about it, because this is an evolving field where we're starting to understand how certain auditory tones and how music can play a role in not only that stress response of being able to relax into sleep, but also, actually changing the quality of sleep that you're getting, where, certain tones and certain sounds can actually affect the quality of sleep that you're getting.
Yeah, there was like pink noise. I know Ben Greenfield was talking to me about it on his when he came on the podcast too. There was an app, I forget the name, but he was talking about pink noise, and so I didn't really dig into it too much. But
yeah, I mean, my general recommendation, honestly, so like binaural beats are also something that's getting a lot of attention, right? And they correlate with with brain waves, and if they correlate with certain brain waves, they can induce these similar states of sleep in the brain when you're sleeping. Honestly, based on all the research that I've done and everyone that I've talked to, I would caution from that. Just for right now, I just don't think it's well enough worked out in the research to really know what the right sound and frequency is, and also the timing. It has to be very succinct with what your brain is doing while you sleep. And if it's not, you can be really
awakened,
fragmenting your sleep. You can be fragmenting. You can go in the opposite direction. So I think, as tempting as it is, until it's really well worked out, I would, caution people from.
Yeah, it's called PZIZZ. I just found the name. So yeah, it seems like there's all these other things that we know work. Let's at least do those. And then there's some other things that are maybe can help, maybe actually can hurt. Who knows? We just don't know at this point.
It's context dependent. It's depending on, if you're using it as your sole means to optimizing your sleep, probably not the best strategy. But
And then for tracking sleep, I know I think I've heard you talk about the Aura before. I use the Aura and the Whoop actually. Is there or I know there's tons of apps on the phone as well. Is there a specific program that you think is easy for people to use that's more on the accurate side?
Yes, I mean, I think this is this is kind of a greater discussion in terms of like the sleep tracker accuracy and depending on what you're using them for, I think is really important. So if you're just like a general health enthusiast and your sleep is otherwise, fairly good, and you're just trying to understand how specific variables can impact your sleep and, little hacks about how you can, kind of take your sleep to the next level, I think it's great. They're great at providing awareness. However, for me, looking through the lens of a coach, and looking through the lens of dealing with people who have, this behavioral component, I sometimes caution from using sleep trackers, at least at the onset, just because sometimes it ends up being this other thing that creates more anxiety around sleep, right? They have this number that they're not getting, and don't get me wrong, for some people this motivates them, right, in the right direction. You just have to know the person that you're working with, and know if this is going to be something that's beneficial for them.
That's a good point.
I think, the sleep trackers in terms of their accuracy are definitely trending in the right direction. They've come a long way. They used to just be actigraphs where they were just looking at movement and trying to estimate, what was happening based on just movement. But now obviously they're taking into account your heart rate variability, your respiratory rate, generally your heart rate. Even some are taking in like O2 sats. And so I think they're trending in the right direction. I think with the understanding that the only true way to match from a clinical perspective what's going on is in a sleep lab, right? Where you're actually hooked up to all these crazy wires. And but with that being said, Oura Ring does a lot of studies where they're where they're comparing to these clinical labs, and they're comparing and based on what I've read and based on my experience, Oura is definitely the most accurate. And in terms of being user friendly, the app is very user friendly. It's easy to just have a ring on your finger as opposed to any of the other potentially bulky devices or anything else, having a watch or so.
Do you use that for during the day as well, or just for sleeping?
Me personally, I use it all the time. But yeah, I mean, with the coaching process, if it's just in the context of sleep, I think that's perfectly fine. But so yeah, it's as with most things, it's the broad answer of it depends. But it really just does depend on the person and on the use case. But I think overall, what these trackers are doing to bring sleep more into the forefront of what we do, I think is awesome. And they're providing people more awareness on just how important sleep is, and how much they should be prioritizing it and tracking it and looking at it and emphasizing it in their life. So I think that part is awesome.
Yeah, I know. It's sometimes because I use both, and sometimes both Whoop and Aura, and sometimes I notice the numbers are a little bit different. And I'm sure that this is not a hard science, and it's still in terms of what I'm referring to is in terms of the sleep, the area of sleep that I'm in, whether it's light, deep, REM, or aware. And so
I think that's the perfect example that when you talk about, it's kind of different layers. So when you talk about like just estimating, your sleep efficiency, right, which is how much time are you actually asleep versus time in bed, I think the majority of them are very accurate.
They're on par with that. Yeah.
They're on par. They're on point. And, I think you find that across the board. The numbers should be very, similar,
Exactly.
App to app or device to device. When you get into the distinction between non-REM and REM, that's the next layer. And they tend to be okay at that, right? Like, because of the fact that you're typically much more physiologically active in the brain and sometimes even in the body during REM sleep. I think, for example, you actually get spikes in your heart rate and heart rate variability when you're in REM sleep. So I think distinguishing between those two is also fairly good. But when you start to get into, the electrical signature and the percentages of how much time you're spending in, non-REM 3 versus non-REM 2, and I think this is where they become a little more murky, where they may be only, even in the case of the Oura Ring, maybe they're only, 60, 70% accurate.
Yeah.
And this is where you'll see differences app to app and device to device. And that's for that exact reason, right? Because
Yeah.
they're not exactly pinpointed.
Even like when I look at, because I think the three main things that determines your sleep score, at least from my understanding, is the heart rate variability, which you want high, resting heart rate, which you want low, and then the overall sleep time spent sleeping, and sleep quality may be another layer to that. What do you say? Those are the three big things that
they're taking into account? Yeah, for sure. I mean, and you're basically what you're doing, and they all have an algorithm, is, you're basically taking those things and you're estimating, the sleep stages, and you're estimating all those other elements, because, like I mentioned, the only way to really know for sure and delineate between those sleep stages is to look at brainwaves. So obviously those, they're not doing that. But again, I think, for the general concept, I think it's really, really helpful, and I think it's trending in the right direction for sure. The other thing is, even when they're inaccurate, so to speak, with respect to these sleep stages, they're consistently inaccurate. So when you talk about, helping to pinpoint how variables, like you talked about, how, your food timing impacts your sleep and all these things, they can still give you information that way because it's consistently in that inaccurate stage. It's still taking into account the same variables. So it's still going to give you contextual information.
That's a good point. Where can people learn more about this sleep stuff? That, I mean, you already gave us a ton of information here, but for the coaches that want to learn more, I know you're building out a course. I want you to just touch on that a little bit, and then for the layman as well, where can they continue to learn more about this? Because sleep is so complex and there's so much to it, and I know we barely scraped the surface here. But yeah, go ahead and tell people a little more there.
Yeah, definitely. It's always like bittersweet when I do, these type of podcasts and talks. Sometimes obviously it's a lot of great information, but sometimes we get like through an hour or an hour and a half, and I feel like we just scratch the surface, and there's so many other things to talk about. But
I know.
But yeah, so you touched on it. Shameless plug. I'm in the process of creating a course on sleep for coaches and for practitioners. So this can appeal to, trainers, strength coaches, physical therapists, occupational therapists, health coaches, massage therapists, anyone who works with someone from the standpoint of health, fitness, performance. Like we've talked about, sleep is going to play a role in some way, shape, or form. I'm really just trying to bring sleep more into the forefront of, the coaching in the health space, and get more practitioners on board with coaching it up and talking about it. So the course will cover, really, it'll be very comprehensive. It'll cover everything from the anatomy and physiology of sleep and the perspective there, different correlations with sleep that sleep has with really every facet of our physiology. And then, really diving into what my entire process is. So what's my assessment process? What's my hierarchy? What's my step-by-step coaching process? What are the materials that you can use in conjunction? What do you do in special situations, working with special populations? With respect to sleep, how do you collaborate with other professionals? So, just trying to check all the boxes.
How long is that course?
Say that again.
How long roughly?
It'll be around 8 hours worth of content. But it'll be all self-paced. It'll be, you can kind of hop around depending on, what the use case for doing it. And, it's the idea of, practitioners can use it if they want to do similar to what I do, where you're actually providing sleep coaching as an additional service, or it can just be, you want to learn everything about it to just adjunct it into what you're already doing, right? Maybe just, interjecting more into your assessment process, and, maybe you're just doing an onboarding sleep coaching session at the onset of working with someone, just to make sure that box is checked, whether it's, a PT or a coach, or you just want to make sure that you check that box. And, so, like I mentioned, it'll be completely self-paced. The website for that is sleepcoachcourse.com. And in conjunction with that, I'm doing a lot of one-day workshops in 2020 as well. And these are just, a condensed version of the course, where we, kind of dive into all these materials in person, and we do some practical coaching, some role playing, all that type of stuff. We go through the breathing side of things. We didn't really talk about breathing related to sleep disorders, but what are some of the structural breathing assessments that you can be looking at, and all those things as well. So, I'm lining up a lot of those one-day workshops for that as well. My overall website, just for the, general person who wants to kind of connect and talk more about sleep, is onlinesleepcoach.com. And on all the social media platforms is, online sleep coach as well.
Perfect. There's two questions that we ask all of our guests that I want to finish this up with. What does prehab mean to you? I know we're trying to preach a proactive approach to living your life, and you kind of talked about a lot of different ways you can be proactive with your sleep, but what does prehab mean to you in a nutshell?
Yeah, I love this, and this is something I'm actually very passionate about. And the sleep stuff has kind of taken me down this path, but I actually have my overarching company, my overarching brand that I have as an LLC it's called Proactive Health and Wellness, and it's really empowering people to take a more proactive and more preventative approach to their health and their well-being. And it comes down to the education piece. So the more that people are educated about all these variables and all the ways that these things impact your potential future health. For me personally, it's something that hits home. I've had two grandparents suffer from Alzheimer's disease, and for anyone who's obviously gone through that with their family, there's really not much worse. So for me, the preventative approach is everything. So yeah, it's something I'm incredibly passionate about for sure.
I know people have even said short sleep, short life. That's this motto that people have.
Unfortunately, yeah, that's definitely the case.
You can't sleep when you're dead. It doesn't work like that. There's no sleep debt that you can just make up for later on in life. It doesn't work like that.
Unfortunately, we got to break a lot of those stigmas, especially in the corporate world where people are, I'll sleep when I'm dead, or sleep is for the weak, or any of those stupid things that people say around sleep. And
yeah, it's just not true. Okay, what about the last thing? What is one piece of advice you'd recommend for our audience? I know you've already gone through a few of these as well, but low-hanging fruit, or not even low-hanging, anything that you would suggest for our audience to implement, something actionable potentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's any of the things that we talked about, but probably one that people don't spend a lot of time doing, and I think would be beneficial to do. I think everybody knows that sleep is important, but take the time to really write out why sleep is important. And I think even if you just look into the things that sleep correlates with, like find whatever your goals are and whatever the things that are important in your life, actually look at some of the correlations that sleep might have with those things, and you'd actually be pretty surprised, I think. And once you connect that, you'll prioritize your sleep a lot more. I think, for example, I'll sometimes tell people, I mean, sleep can impact how you interact with the people that you love, right? Your temperament, we've all experienced this when you're not sleeping, as opposed to when you're getting good quality sleep, is very different. So, I mean, even if your goal is to be a better person and a better husband, better wife, better father, I think, again, I don't want to make sleep the answer to every problem and say that if you get, better sleep,
but it's a piece of it.
But it's definitely a significant piece. And I think the more that you appreciate that and the more that you connect that to your goals, the easier it is to take those other steps going forward that you need to improve your sleep or anything for that matter. Yeah.
I love it. The why behind it. That's everything. All right, Nick Lambe, thanks for hopping on. I learned a lot about sleep. This was awesome. Thanks again for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for having me on.
Sleep doesn't get talked about nearly as much as it should. And I think Nick shed some light on a lot of different issues with sleep and things that you can do today to improve your sleep quality. Something that I thought was very fascinating, and a quote that I'll just recap, is you wouldn't sit at the dining room table and wait to be hungry. You would only sit when you are hungry. The same thing applies for sleep. I thought that was pretty fascinating. If you enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. This helps us and get the message out there with Prehab and taking a proactive approach to your health. And if there's any other topics or people that you want us to interview with this podcast, please just drop a comment below. Let us know, and we would love to dive into whatever topics or interviewer that you want us to go into next.